Thank you very much, Evaristo, for giving us the opportunity to share some of our research this afternoon on women and children as prisoners of war in Britain. I'm going to start our presentation this afternoon, and then Abigail is going to pick up the story where I leave off. So let's begin with an overview of current scholarship. Women and children in warfare in the 18th and 19th centuries are often barely visible, even if the study of military history in Europe is beginning to expand to look at the role of people of colour, women and children. Despite work such as Julie Wainwright's Amazons and Military Maids as long ago as 1989, scholars have since struggled to get beyond a dichotomy summed up by the title of David Cordingley's 2001 volume on women at sea, Heroines and Harlots. Time and again, historians fall into placing women into a sexually defined category to the exclusion of all others, to use a quote from Linda Grant-Dupour. Even the very recent work by Maria Goupil-Travers, Brave combattante, humble héroïne, from 2021, looks at women who fought, making a clear and deliberate distinction between those who bore arms for political reasons and those who were with an army for economic reasons. She sees war as a space in which gender norms can be contested, even if her focus remains on those who took up arms. But one of the difficulties of moving beyond the binary distinction of those who fight and those who don't is the difficulty of finding evidence. As Linda Grant-Dupour points out in Battle Cries and Lullabies, finding women in both primary and secondary sources requires a special approach because they do not fit into the traditional formula. Many women in warfare remain invisible, but there are times when they do appear in the archives, most notably when they are captured and registered as prisoners of war. During the 18th century, Britain established a network of prison depots around the British Isles to receive prisoners of war taken during the many conflicts of the period. The Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars with France saw arguably the largest number of prisoners held in Britain, with an estimated 250,000 held in the country between 1793 and 1815. This mass movement of people and the documentation associated with it provides historians with a unique opportunity to explore the lives and experiences of those captured during warfare. Whilst most prisoners captured during war were in military service, other, smaller numbers of prisoners were not. Women and children were caught up in warfare, and the papers of the Admiralty departments that administered prisoners of war provide a unique opportunity for historians to uncover the lives of ordinary people caught up in and displaced by a world at war. There are a number of advantages to studying prisoners of war. Firstly, the records flatten the distinction between combatant and non-combatant, and thereby allow us to go beyond this dichotomy of soldier and camp follower. And secondly, the records give us the names of those who would otherwise have remained invisible, most notably the names of women and children whose involvement in war would otherwise pass unnoticed. This paper will use the prisoner of war records to address a gap in prisoner of war studies. The focus is limited to the records for the prisons and prison ships in Hampshire on the south coast of England, but with a view to comparing and contrasting with other groupings of prisoners of war so that it becomes possible to move beyond individual case studies. In 1796, over 2,000 prisoners of war from the Caribbean arrived in Britain. Most were black or mixed race, and the entry registers at Portchester Castle give us a precious insight into their lives. Amongst them were a significant number, 78 women, 23 children, so a significant number of women and children, the majority of whom were either black or mixed race. By recovering their story, we could get a glimpse into lives that were affected by war, but would have in most circumstances been unrecorded in traditional military history source material. So a little bit of background as to how these prisoners arrived at Portchester. In May 1796, British forces defeated the French on the island of St. Lucia. The French forces, who were mostly black and mixed race soldiers, were treated as prisoners of war, placed onto British transport ships and taken from the Caribbean to Britain to be held in the prison depots of Portchester and Fortin on the edges of Portsmouth Harbour. On arrival, the male prisoners of war were divided up. Most were sent to the depot at Portchester. The most sick and all the women and children were sent to the prison at Fortin in Gosport, about 6 miles from Portchester. A clerk from Portchester Prison, a man called Richard Randall, helped to process the prisoners and described finding 4 women on board the Hope transport ship. Randall's letter gives us an extremely rare eyewitness account of the women, writing, The 4 women informed me they were all married and were very solicitous to have their husbands with them, which of course I could not comply with. At the same time, I told them I would mention the matter to you, at which they seemed satisfied. This was not the first time that prisons had dealt with female prisoners, and in a letter, Prison Commissioner Dr. Johnson described what had been done in the past. When we had on a former occasion ladies of the same description at Fortin, they were indulged with their husbands, parents, or children and brothers. The same procedure was followed, and eventually male prisoners who were family members were sent to Fortin to join the women and children. The arrival of so many women and children at Portchester gives rise to a number of questions, most notably about their capture in the Caribbean. How were they captured? How were they designated as prisoners of war? Were these women and children seen as combatants by the British forces? Were they non-combatants but directly engaged in the logistical support of those fighting? Were British officers in the Caribbean consciously categorising them as prisoners of war, or simply allowing families to stay together? We don't yet have answers to those questions. But regardless of their precise role in the conflict between Britain and France in the Caribbean, once at Portchester and Fortin, they become visible in a way that many women present in battle in other conflicts are not. When we look in detail at how they were treated, we see that while there was some distinction made between male and female prisoners of war, for example, where they were lodged, what access they had to relatives, the difficulties in clothing them, much of what we can say about them is complicated by a lack of documentary evidence and the contradictory nature of some of that evidence. I'm now going to hand over to Abigail to explain more about the women at Fortin Prison.
So, piecing together the lives of the women and children from the Caribbean held at both Portchester and Fortin is complicated because it entails gathering scattered fragments together from which to reconstruct their lives. The women and children had entered a world of captivity and its administration, one that had been constructed to administer male captives of war, not women and children. So to find them entails putting together tiny fragments of information from which to construct a narrative. The fragments can be found in the lists of food, clothing, as well as prison and parole registers. Of course, much about them is simply missing or went unrecorded. But despite this, it's possible still to reconstruct something of their lives. A prison report written just after the Caribbean prisoners arrived in Britain debated how they were all to be cared for. This report mainly discusses the male prisoners of war, but also briefly debates how to victual the women and children. It was decided to give them the hospital diet, because that would allow them access to a fire and heat, something which the prison staff thought was essential for prisoners who had been used to the warmth of the Caribbean. Traces of the women and children can also be found in the prison's orders for clothing. The prison didn't have a stock of clothing for women and children, so extra supplies had to be ordered. 2 months later, the clothing still hadn't arrived, but the prison instead had to issue the women and children with additional blankets, presumably to turn into clothing. There are a few details about where in the prison hospital the women and children were being held. Prisoners of war in Britain were usually segregated by nationality, and it seems likely that the women and children were also segregated, probably to keep them away from the other male prisoners until their male relatives were allowed to join them. An inventory of 1807 provides clues as to how the prison hospital may have been arranged during the time that the women and children from the Caribbean were there. From this inventory here on the slide, we can make out that the hospital buildings consisted of 2 floors. They were divided up into wards, and these wards varied in size, but they all had unbarred windows. They had fireplaces, locks on the door, so could provide secure and warm spaces. So it's probably some of these wards that were used for the women and children. And in one of the buildings, the inventory actually describes an area called a cabin, possibly created to provide privacy for the sickest prisoners, but they are spaces that could also have been utilised as accommodation for women and children. This inventory is also useful as it provides evidence of the presence of a female prison workforce. it's possible that this workforce may have been involved with the day-to-day needs of the women and children. Those staffing Britain's war prisoners are, like the prisoners themselves, generally viewed as being male. But scattered through the prisoner of war records are references to women working inside the prisons, for example, as matrons, seamstresses, washerwomen. Their presence is not restricted to land prisons either. They can also be found working on board the prison hulks. So marked on this 1807 inventory for Fortin Prison is a room called the Matron's Apartments. And from other records elsewhere, we know that the prison matron was Mrs. Arnold. She worked at the prison alongside her husband, the prison steward, and her daughter Elizabeth also worked as a prison matron on board one of the prison ships in Portsmouth Harbour. There are letters from quite a few of the female workforce from various prisons around Britain, which survive today. And these are all letters from women seeking to work or actually working in the prisoner of war prisons and on board the hulks. And this allows us to rethink the prison environment. Perhaps they weren't quite the male gendered spaces that they were thought to be. And whilst male prison staff, for example, the medical staff, may have been involved with the care of the women and children from the Caribbean, it's possible that there were interactions between female captives and the female members of staff. But of course, these interactions may have been complicated also by notions of race. So after the arrival of all the Caribbean prisoners in 1796, an initial estimate of how many had arrived was sent to the Admiralty in London. The numbers of male prisoners, as you can see, are broken down by race, whilst the women and children were not. This letter gives a total of 2,512 prisoners of war who had arrived. 99 of these, in fact, there are a few more. This isn't a particularly accurate assessment. There's some numbers missing here. But in this estimate, 99 women and children are recorded as arriving. But of course, they haven't been, their race hasn't been designated. So it'd be easy to suggest that this letter therefore demonstrates that the women and children were all white and that they were family members of those few white European officers or soldiers who are recorded in this particular letter. But the issue is more complicated, as we will see from the next slide. When we recover the names of these women and children from inside Fortin's prison register, we discover that they were recorded mostly as women of colour. There is only one woman who is recorded as white. The children don't have their race recorded. They're listed only by gender, for example, boy or girl. But it's likely that most of them were children of colour. The men also had their race recorded in Fortin's prison register. For example, ordinary soldiers were recorded as black soldier or white soldier. Non-commissioned officers are occasionally recorded by their race, either black or as white, but not consistently so. And higher ranking officers are recorded by their rank only rather than their race, even though a large proportion of these higher ranking officers are in fact men of colour. Fortin Prison, therefore, records the race of the prisoners from the Caribbean, except the army officers, who may be men of colour, and the children, who also may be children of colour. Women, men from lower military ranks do have their race recorded. And as we can see from the next register, Porchester, as we see from Porchester, this is the way they're recorded is completely different, because at Porchester, the prison doesn't record anyone's race in the register. The prisoners of war are all recorded only by their name, their military rank, and their battalion. The only clue as to potentially what their race might be is their place of capture, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, and Grenada. The estimate quoted above in the letter and the evidence from Fortin, however, allows us to guesstimate that around 80% of the male prisoners of war arriving from the Caribbean were probably men of colour. yet at Porchester they're not described as such. When in May 1797, the Caribbean prisoners who were imprisoned at Fortin, including the women and children, were transferred to Porchester, the prison continued not to record their race. So for some reason we don't quite understand at the moment, race is considered an important thing to record at Fortin prison, but not at Porchester. And we're still not sure why, but it might have something to do with hospitals, but at the moment I'm not quite sure. So if we go on to slide 18, there is still a lack of documentary evidence that details the day-to-day lives of the female prisoners inside the prison. But there are a few pieces of documentary evidence that can help us begin this process of recovery. For example, through the infants who are recorded as being born to the women inside the prison. At least 5 children are recorded as being born inside Fortin prison to the Caribbean women. The race of only one of these infants is given. So, for example, an infant, Maria Louisa, was born in Fortin prison on the 3rd of November 1796, just after the prisoners had arrived in Britain. All had been captured in May and early June in the Caribbean, put onto ships, which then arrived in Portsmouth Harbour in October 1796. So if Maria Louisa was carried to term by her mother, then her mother had been pregnant during the fighting in the Caribbean, her capture and incarceration on a ship, as well as the grueling journey across the Atlantic. Now, neither Maria Louisa's parents nor her race is recorded in Fortin's prison register, but there are other infants also recorded, such as Charles, Marie, and Geneviève Magloire, who are also born in the prison, but there's no indication also as to who their parents were. But despite not knowing this, we can at least, from the prison register, suggest a possible parent for one of the infants, Geneviève Magloire. There is a French Caribbean officer called Magloire Pelage, who recorded in Fortin's prison register, who may be Geneviève's father. And we're basing that on the shared name of Magloire. Now, Pelage is a well-known officer of colour in the French army in the Caribbean. And in fact, he's later recorded in a French census as living in Paris in about 1807 with 2 daughters. So it's possible that Geneviève, recorded here in the register in Fortin, is one of those daughters later recorded in Paris. Unfortunately, Geneviève's mother's name is not known, but we do know that Pelage arrived in Britain on board a transport vessel called the Valiant, and that there are on board that vessel 5 women, all of colour. And so it seems likely that Geneviève's mother is one of those women. But the lack of familial identification by the prisons may have been due to a lack of space in the registers, or because the prison didn't have space to record or didn't expect to record family details that often, because in fact it's a system primarily designed to record male prisoners of war. Familial relationships are more likely to be recorded in parole records for military officers and their families in British towns and villages. And there's numerous examples of women and children paroled as prisoners of war in British parole records. But by looking at a few pieces of information that we have about the infants born at Fortin, we can recover the risks for female prisoners of having children in prison. This is evidenced by the death certificate for one infant, Daniel Chanouette, a boy of colour. Daniel was born inside Fortin prison and declared dead on the 22nd of March 1797. And like the other infants discussed here, there's no record of who his parents were. But from the prison register, we can guess that the most likely candidate for at least one of his parents, due to the shared name of Chanouette, is a French officer, Guillaume Chanouette. But Daniel's death in prison was not unusual. Other children and women from amongst the Caribbean prisoners of war are also listed as DD, or declared dead. The registers record at least 16 other women and children as dying whilst at Fortin prison, about 15.8% over a period of 6 months. The men, from amongst the men are recorded 91 deaths from amongst approximately 515 male prisoners. That's about 17.6%. Now, Danielle Chanouette's name was first entered into Fortin's prison register on the 30th of January 1797, and this was probably the date that he was born in the prison. If it was, then he was approximately 2 months old when he died inside Fortin's prison of convulsions. The paper presented here is intended to use the Caribbean women and children at Fortin and Porchester prisons to demonstrate the potential for prisoner of war studies to be used to include those who have been neglected in traditional narratives of war. Women, children, those of different races are often barely visible in these narratives, or as Kate pointed out, only certain types get written about, for example, social elites, women dressing as men, female combatants. It is true that the presence of women and children can be fragmentary, but that does not mean that they should be seen as an anomaly, or, as is often the case, written off as camp followers, with all the negative connotations that that phrase suggests. Perhaps there should be a new vocabulary for them, and that we should think before always assigning a sexual context to the presence of women. Women and children, those are different races, and I have numerous examples, not just the ones presented here today, were prisoners of war and were part of the prisoner of war prison system, some as workforce, others as prisoners, often held in prison for extended periods of time. And so what the source material potentially tells us is new and different about war and incarceration as experienced by women and children. And what can it also tell us about the male experience as well? Because in the prisoner of war records, we see the ordinary women, the ordinary children and men, and the effect that war and imprisonment had on them. So prisoner of war studies presents a real opportunity to rethink assumptions about warfare and the capture of prisoners of war and to say something new. Thank you.